We're happy to be here today and having a conversation about free community spaces and what that means. I'll be your facilitator. My name is Kayla. I use she or they pronouns. I'm a network organizer with PowerShift, and I'm on Ho-Chunk land, also known as Madison, Wisconsin. I'm joined by these three lovely humans who will be talking all about community centers and the work that they do. So I just want to give them a little space to say their names, their pronouns, their organization, a little bit about what they do, but we'll learn a lot more about them in a few minutes. But yeah, Saren, if you want to start us off.
Yeah, hey folks, my name is Saren. I use they, them pronouns, and I'm kind of playing two roles. So I work at PSN as the Political Education and Trainings Coordinator, but I'm also here as a guest panelist in regards to a organization slash like side project called Marxist Mushrooms. And I'm currently in Western Massachusetts, also known as Nipmuc land. And yeah, I'm excited for this conversation. Dan, would you like to go next?
Sure, thank you. My name is Dan. I'm the founder and operations coordinator of the Greater New Orleans Caring Collective. I reside in Bulbancha, so-called New Orleans, and very happy to be here with you all today. He or they pronouns.
Hey everybody, my name is Anthony Diaz, co-founder and executive director of the Newark Water Coalition. I use he, him pronouns, and we are on Lenape land in New Jersey.
Sweet. All right. So we're going to be having a pretty fluid conversation today without too much structure. So the attendees feel free to engage in the chat if you have any questions that come up. We can try to get to them like as we do the webinar instead of leaving them all to the end. And we'll be talking about what free community spaces are, the steps to creating one, and their space's role in countering institutions. Great, yeah, and these are the kind of the folks that I go to and I look to for inspiration when I'm feeling really down about the state of the world. They're really optimistic and grounding folks that are creating strong and resilient community structures. And so these are the kind of safe spaces that are critical, central, and often overlooked when we think about climate change and climate disaster. So I'm happy to be giving space to a really important part of the movement here. And I'm going to be sharing my screen now. All righty. Okay, so in the context of this webinar, what are free community spaces? This is a really vague term that can be interpreted in a lot of ways, but in this context, these spaces are ones that provide inclusive, open, and physically safe gathering spaces, provide basic needs for community members, water, food, clothing, etc., and explicitly counter capitalism by cultivating community interdependence and self-sufficiency that is resilient outside of institutions. So this is unique as opposed to, say, a library or a public library, which we would usually consider like a free space that everyone knows about. That wouldn't count under our definition of today because that is dependent on the government to run and doesn't explicitly counter capitalism. Whereas maybe like a community-owned library or a library that is a part of the Greater New Orleans Caring Collective, which Dan is talking about, would be counted as like a free community space under our definition today. And so examples of these free spaces that we'll be talking about today are distributions, free stores, community connectors, as is Marxist Mushrooms, which Saren will be talking about, time banking, and DIY or do it yourself. But now, after giving you some context, I'm going to hand it over to Anthony to outline what Newark Water Coalition is.
Hey everybody, so real quickly, I'll just read our mission. The Newark Water Coalition acknowledges that water, housing, and food is a human right. Our intention is to cultivate a self-determined local, national, and international community of people who recognize the connection between systemic environmental racism and capitalism. NWC fights to liberate natural resources, whether it be food, land, air, or water, as sources of life for all. So pretty much we do whatever we want, however we want, but this is like, for the folks out there that really kind of need like a one pager or something like that. Our methodology or our praxis is like by any means necessary. And a lot of people take that in the concept or in the framework of violence, but I really mean like, yo, it's 2022. We need to stop using the same and tired old modalities that we've used in the past as organizers, and that anything that you want to do, just fucking do it. Like that is the point that I am going to stress the most out of this webinar. That, what I've seen or the landscape is that a lot of folks talk about stuff, but they don't really do anything. And we're in a period of time where we're moving with a sense of urgency, or at least I feel that sense of urgency. So just please do anything. Next slide, please. So our work, this is just a small example. So we do food distributions and water distributions about 3 or 4 times a week from different locations across the city of Newark. Newark is about a city of 300,000 people. So our work, as we would love to be widespread, is really hyper local. But we're really well known as being one of the most radical groups in the city because a lot of people are beholden to whatever current structures. We started community fridges in our city. We were the first organization to do it. We own and operate 3 community refrigerators. And as a result, it has pushed other organizations to do it and even got the city government to start funding them because they have to have their name on everything. And then our last thing is water boxes. Our water boxes is a big project. That's how we started our distributions. This is we're the Newark Water Coalition, so obviously we mainly give out water. We supply mutual aid groups across the state. We've partnered with organizations in Nigeria to build out water boxes and give them technology to test their water, because we believe, again, it's like international solidarity. A lot of people talk about it, but what does it look like in practice? And so finally, just recently, we opened up an office space in the city of Newark. We are on Clinton Ave in Stratford, which is one of the, I would say like, it's one of the worst blocks in Newark, if not the worst blocks. I have seen some wild shit just being in the office space for the last 2 months. But what it made me realize is that a lot of people, again, there's so many cliches that we have in organizing, like meet community where they're at and all this other stuff. But when you're in the thick of it, when you're really meeting community where they're at, you really know. And you know what's important and you know what's not important. So I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you, Anthony. So once again, I'm Dan, here they pronouns, founded Geno Caring Collective. And even before going into this, I can really just say that last point is so important. Like we really, it's about the actions we take. And when we go to support people, it's about taking their leadership about what their needs are. That's kind of how we started, and that's how we organize. We do general community care and support for our community. Started at the beginning of the pandemic and just kept going and evolving from pandemic support into hurricane relief work, tornado relief work now, and now we're preparing for the next storm. Started off thinking about the greater area of Bulbancha itself, and how do we make sure we're not thinking about just Orleans Parish, for example, county for those in other states. How can we make sure we're there for the larger community around this metropolitan area, and that ended up becoming, okay, well, now that Hurricane Ida has hit, we have to organize for all of the parishes that are going to be without power for 6 weeks. It's not just about what we've already done. It's that seeking the people that you'd like to support's leadership, like actually going to find them and saying, hey, what would be useful to you? And that's kind of how we always organized and commingled with our partnerships and sought that leadership from the places, whether it's hyper local or regional, like the people who are actually doing the work there, just saying like, hey, what would be actually useful to you, rather than showing up and saying, hey, we know better than you what you need, so here it is, you're welcome. Anyway, so next slide, please. We are very blessed to have an incredible amount of resources at the community center we're at. A lot of it came out of the hurricane relief work, but so much of it, as with so much of this work, is building relationships. For a long time at this space we're at, we had a small storage cage, and that was the entire footprint we had ourselves. But as events happen, and you build relationships and you do things, people see that, and they see the actions over time, and they say like, well, what can we build around this, or how can we support you? And we're lucky to have great partnerships. I mean, this store Plan B, which is a very important thing to have. I put it down in the little corner there. I have a lovely little cabinet with it in it, and people can I don't even need to personally know about it. Can come get it as needed. But that's the kind of community resources that we have to really think about. It's like holistic care and support. Like, it's not just food, it's going to be personal care supplies, it's going to be cleaning care and baby and children's supplies. Anyhow, so the free clothing boutique is actually being built right now as we speak. So I just painted it the other day. It's an unfinished look, but it's going to have hanging clothing racks, a dignified space to come grab clothing and accessories and other things. So I'm looking forward to that a lot. But it's part of it is, you have to think about, if you're going to support people, like, how can you make the most accessible to it, and in what ways can you be accountable to that? Because it's honestly, it's shockingly easy to get resources. Like Anthony said, like, just if you have an idea, just do it, just try it. Especially if you have a lot of privilege like I do, people are like desperate to just give you stuff because they don't know what to do. They're like, oh my God, this would be helpful to someone. And you're like, well, who? And like, well, how do you do it? Okay, fine. And you end up with the whole, suite of resources. And as long as you are actually getting them somewhere, that can be a very meaningful privilege to leverage. Get that stuff and then put it in the hands of the people who should have been getting it already. Next slide, please. So this is just part of the amazing resource, but this is like kind of, all of these things are important. We're just very fortunate to have them in the same location. We have a free library. The public library is throwing away books. So we said, sure, we'll take some. And now we have, people go in, they shop through the free store, they're going to shop in the clothing boutique. And when they walk out, they have free books to take, There's also an art residency in our community center. It primarily benefits a couple BIPOC members of Southern Solidarity, which is a partner organization of ours. But long-term, it'll be a mixed use space for creativity and solidarity. Go ahead, please. And this is a giant room of just clothing donations, because people love to donate clothing. If you ever ask for clothing donations, be careful. Be careful what you ask for. But the black bins are all organized and they're ready to go into the clothing boutique room and be hung. Everything to the right is just soup, just bags of random things that might or might not be useful. But that's part of it is, another privilege is having the space for things to go. And if you can do that and you can keep the process going of organizing those things to become relatable, like that free store picture in the first slide, if it was just a bunch of stacks, it'd be insane. Thankfully, we haven't needed much money yet. I reach out to local businesses and partner with restaurants and tell people what do we have going on. We also, it's a preposterously cheap amount. Like, it's not a commercial amount. The space the church we operate out of is very supportive and is not trying to make this a commercial endeavor. So it's yet another privilege. It's hard to get a place like where there are all these things together. Very hard. So it's very, very lucky and fortunate. I can't move outside of that when I talk about our access to resources. And it's just, I don't think there's a place where you can expect to get these kinds of things for an affordable price, especially as we don't really fundraise very much. We try to let other organizations fundraise and just get access to the things, the privileged resources that people will just give us. Go ahead, please. One really big part of that, though, is that the first Unitarian Universalist Church of New Orleans is an incredible partner, and they have an incredible amount of resources. You know, they have this commercial kitchen that we don't even really use because people give us food all the time, but the walk-in refrigeration during weather event and relief work, this is just an amazing resource to have access to. Next slide, please. And likewise, they have a lot of meeting space for us. We have partnerships with different organizations that come and have gatherings here, you know, have plans to put on events and things like that. It's just an incredible resource that we have access to that isn't even part of our rent. And that kitchen's bigger than it looks even in the picture. It's crazy. And one of our very important partnerships is with Southern Solidarity. We started off as general community care and support. You know, how can we utilize mutual aid to do the best we can to keep people who are at risk safe from COVID, whether it was, you know, supporting them in self-quarantining or bringing health measures out to our unhoused neighbors and immigrant neighbors and everyone. And Southern Solidarity was a Black, queer, founded and led organization that was doing unhoused solidarity, like started the same time as us. And we were like, oh, well, okay, no more GNOCC unhoused solidarity. We just put energy into this organization, support its leadership, you know, bolster what it has going on. And 2 years later, that's, you know, still, we're very much connected. You know, I and many others are a member of Southern Solidarity. And so this is all unhoused support. So just like past all of our community center, we have this whole organization that takes out food, clothing, you know, personal care supplies, Narcan, Plan B, you know, basic case management out to the unhoused camps. So a very important part of what we do is directly leveraging what we get access to in order to support their work.
Wow, well those two are definitely going to be hard to follow, because that is some incredible work that you have been doing, Dan, in your collective, as well as you, Anthony. I have to say that Marxist Mushrooms is not nearly as mature as those two mutual aid projects / organizations, and in fact is very much off of the branch of like mutual aid that is, if you have an idea, just fucking do it, which I also firmly believe in, hence Marxist Mushrooms. So I'd love to tell you a little bit about it. So Marxist Mushrooms is an urban mushroom farm and educational resource that was started by me as an anarchist and political organizer, and one of my close friends as an indigenous like climate organizer from Texas. And we basically wanted to focus on connecting community and reimagining local food structures through the dissemination of knowledge and skills on how to grow, eat, and live with mushrooms. And basically we would grow gourmet and medicinal mushrooms with an emphasis on connecting to community mutual aid models that empower, liberate, and nourish all marginalized communities, and just radically change the way that generations viewed food. So the idea or the concept is that mushrooms are a wonderful example, and I'm sure we've seen them blow up over the past couple of years, but they're a wonderful example of decentralized networks, right? You take a little bit of nutrients and it can go anywhere and everywhere because the way that the mycelium underground spreads towards who needs them. And I started growing fungi and realizing that, you could basically grow mushrooms out of nothing, whether that's toilet paper and scraps from the farmer's market, whether that is, a $3 investment to like local shiitake and just putting it in cardboard with cardboard. There was a million ways that you could produce this incredible fungus basically that had a wonderful sense or source of zinc, calcium, protein, iron that could be really fulfilling. And being from the part of Texas in El Paso where we see a lot of Latino flair leaning into decolonizing their diet, or Latino culture leaning into decolonizing their diet and instead replacing a lot of the meat necessarily that has been previously put as like al pastor or a taco, and replacing it with a more vegan or a healthier option that is also like less influential or negatively impactful on the larger climate crisis, which has been mushrooms. And so me and my friend was like, okay, so we know we want to grow mushrooms. You can grow them out of nothing. And I had previously worked for years at a food bank and then organizing for years. And so I was like, I have a steady job and I don't really need to make any kind of money. Why don't we just grow these and connect with different mutual aid groups and different food banks and different churches and different masjids and or mosques and see how we can just get this food out there. And at first it was just like, oh, we're just going to try this and we'll see how it goes. And then it absolutely exploded. We had a lot of people who were interested in this idea of growing food, knowing and giving it nourishment, knowing that it's going to people regardless of what you would get back from it. And a lot of people interested in this idea of sharing this food and the knowledge of how to implement it, not only in their diets, but also how to recreate it and grow it from home in a much shorter of a lifespan than say like a normal plant or a normal crop. And so from there, we realized that we wanted to share the information and continue the dissemination of education and information to people to also spread that information. Sorry, that's a lot of information, to also spread the ability to grow mushrooms for their community, for a local farm, for a local church, so on and so forth. We had no idea, so many people didn't know how to grow mushrooms. And so basically that led to me doing a lot of just like free trainings and teaching people how to use recycled materials to grow mushrooms, to continue to grow them, to then take that like leftover soil or fertilizer and where to dispose of it or where to put it, connecting individuals, coffee shops, and even a couple logging companies who have extra sawdust, to different mutual aid organizations who wanted to start their own mushroom initiative, just kind of like being more of what I think my role was in this entire project, which was a community connector and showing people that you can give information and it can be empowering, and you can be empowering just by leading an example. I didn't have the ability or the capacity as someone working, like multiple jobs and side hustles to build something from the ground up. And I think a lot of people who go into organizing should recognize that you need to look around the room and see what people are doing before you like kind of start your own thing, or before you think about what that community is or isn't needing. And when I looked around in Central Virginia, I realized that we had some really incredible mutual aid organizations that were already doing that work. MAD RVA, RVA Henrico, or Mutual Aid Henrico, the Black Ballers. We had a lot of mutual aid groups that had already been doing that work, but there is a lack of fresh and organic farms that were willing to let go of some of the produce just because of the style of gentrification, and farmers markets had really built up and occupied the market in the area for small time farmers. And so I was like, what do I want to teach myself, and what do I have a lot of leftovers to do. And as someone who also really believes in like sharing that message of like decentralized information and also interconnectedness and community, I thought Marxist Mushrooms was a wonderful way to be political about food, because food is political, whether we want to realize it or not. And so yeah, it is definitely not an entire organization, but it is a couple homies who wanted to figure out a way that they could do mutual aid in the best way that they thought was possible, um, while being able to only have so much capacity. And from there, it's now spread. We're now migrating to El Paso, um, but it's now spread slash morphed into the idea of being a part of a larger mutual aid organization and having a home in El Paso to be a part of.
Thanks so much for sharing some intros to your initiative. So now we'll just get into some conversation about it. I want to go to Daryl's question in the chat for Anthony. Daryl said, when I lived in Newark, neighborhoods were silos. How are you encouraging wide distribution across neighborhoods? Is that still a problem?
The thing that, yes, the short answer is yes, it's still a problem. And I think it's true of any city that each block is different. Like literally my block compared to the two parallel blocks are radically different. Like super, like my block is not that quiet, but people get shot on the block next over. So I'm okay with a little noise. Now, what I think has broken down the silos a lot is being willing to say yes and no to certain events and situations. So, we're of the mind frame of like, if anyone asks us to distribute water, we will do it at any event. And so we've linked up with community farmers, we've linked up with other distros, we've linked up with mutual aid organizers, we linked up with nonprofits, we linked up with food pantries. Food pantries was a big one because they give out food, but not really beverages or water oftentimes. So, we try to make connections where it seems like it makes sense, but we also make connections where it's like we have no business being there, but we're going to take space there because that's what we do. So by being open and random to different events, it has allowed us to hit different networks and reach different people to inform them of the distributions and seeing if we can partner with other people to open up spaces and find out and work in areas where we're not active in. And so organically, it is a slow burn, but it has helped us foster relationships with not only different community-based organizations, but different communities across Newark.
Thanks. Yeah. And I think Dan touched on this a bit, but Frank Cetera asked how our occupancy costs of the space is funded.
I know for us it's grants, and then like donations. We get like a lot of donations. One of the things that I cannot stress enough is do what you are passionate about, and the funding and the resources will come. Do not try to hunt money and resources, because those are the two things that you will have the least of. So push out that good into the world. Like all the money we get in, we push right back out. And it becomes like this cycle of just like, hey, we get it in, push it back out, get it in and push it back out. We have, it's kind of crazy how like years ago when we started the organization, we didn't have a pot to piss in or two nickels to rub together, but we were just doing the right thing. And as of last year, we brought in over $300,000 in between donations and grants and all kinds of shit. So for me, that's wild. Like I never in a million years thought we would be there financially. But we've again just pushing it out, doing the work, making sure that we're held accountable to the communities that we're serving, and they have taken care of us exponentially.
Yeah, agree completely. For Geno Caring Collective, we We brought in less than $20,000 in donations last year, and one was from one $15,000 grant. And we just stretched it, you know, because we had a lot of other privileged access to the resources themselves. You know, we put a lot of it into solidarity with other organizations, and then ended up spending a lot of it on hurricane relief work towards the end of the year, when it was like, oh, well, we have, you know, we didn't just spend this money for no reason, but we were like preparing it for community. Boom, let's spend it all on hurricane relief work, because what do we really need it for? And yeah, do what you love, do what is passionate in your heart about a specific practical thing that you can make a difference on. And you know, I mean, I started Genome Caring Collective accidentally in my bedroom the night I got furloughed from my fine dining job. And I never could have dreamed that even in 2020 it would be to the scale of God. In church space. So that specifically, as far as, so yeah, money, like you'll get money when you really need it, because you'll be in a situation where you're doing the work for the community and you have credibility based upon that. But to respond to that subsidized space, like we're just a tenant, like they just have space to rent. So we aren't part of the church. We aren't connected to them. So I think in a lot of situations where people are utilizing community space, it's going to be something where they're tenants, not part of that itself. So like we just rent, you know, we have a rental contract for a certain amount of space here.
And I'll say, when we first started, we were in a church basement, and they kicked us out because of our abolish the police stance. But then we found another church where the pastor is like, I'm with it. I'll ride for you, whatever. And what I've seen is, you know, when you talk about relational organizing or community building or community spaces, like these things happen organically. We started doing distributions there about 1.5 years ago. And what we found was that some of the people that came and got food and water were inquiring about the church. So then I'm like, hey, you know, the pastor, I was like, hey, people want to know, can you put some flyers up? And then there's another community organization in that church as well. And so community members were not only volunteering for us, but they were volunteering for the other organization. And then they started coming to the church because they realized, like, this is a gathering space. This is a safe space for me to be in, whether, you know, whatever your beliefs are or whatever you're there for. But that wasn't our intention. And it kind of had this like crazy, you know, extra output that we obviously not gonna shy away from. We kind of embrace it now.
Yeah, so I want to kind of expand on Frank's question a little bit and ask about, like, your spaces obviously are sometimes working within institutions as you receive grants or you work within a church or something. So like, what does that balance feel like while you're countering institutions while working within them, and how are you still countering institutions while working within them?
I always say it's better to ask for forgiveness than permission. That's how we roll.
I would also speak to that. I had a church that didn't want to receive food from me for their food bank or food pantry because of our name, because of the very stance of like our food is political, like Marxist mushrooms. And I basically told them, like, is our food grown any differently because of our political stance versus like another food or another positionality, or another like farmer's political positionality. And much like Anthony, I found that that was a no budge and that they were going to feel the way they felt. And I was like, they're like, you can distribute here if you like change your name. But we had like flyers at our table and stuff like that. Like part of it was about educating people around community and like leftist values and like finding alternative forms outside of just the oligarchist state that we have to access food. And literally down the street, I ended up finding an Episcopal church that was like, oh my gosh, no, we'll host like Mushroom Mondays. Like you guys should come on down, like right here in front of the red doors. And I found that like philosophically, I had to make the choice of like, yeah, I could have accessed more people, which would have been like more immediate good if we're looking at things on a scale of like good or bad, had I just like not tabled and just given the resources, which had I been a bigger farm, maybe I would have. But I felt that part of the mission slash like the whole point of Marxist Mushrooms is the dissemination of knowledge, again, for alternative systems and for alternative areas around like food liberation and thought. And so I had to make the decision to like say no and instead use literally a church down the street, where I'm hoping that if folks are being turned away because of like not having documents or not being in with a certain zip code, which can happen, maybe they'll go to the next one over, you know, the next church over. But it definitely is tricky, because part of why we're still such a small farm slash like small project is because I don't want to have to deal with the larger state and the way that the state deals with nonprofits and grants. And are you an LLC? Do you have a farm number? Like, there are so many ways that you can get tripped up on just wanting to do this work, but then having to go through the avenues of legitimization by the state. And so one of the best ways for the size that we are now, that we saw going through, was just like not accepting any external donations, not making a profit off of any external like giving, but having a group of people who are deciding to invest in a said project just outside of the realms of like actual documentation that's verified by the state. So instead of having the state basically hold that risk, we're having an intentional amount of like conversation, intentionality, community, relationship building of a group of people who are deciding to go in on a project that can then continue to refurbish itself and continue to give. And that is why we opted as trying to stay away from having to deal with state institutions as much as possible, and instead either looking at gifted spaces that we were able to use, or it was like somebody's garage, or like my landlord let us use the basement when we weren't renting it, or even just like, that's the wonderful thing about mushroom growing, is that you can do it from literally almost anywhere. So just like growing a certain amount in each person's decentralized space, knowing that the fruit of all of that is going to be able to be delivered regardless. But yeah.
I'd just like to add to that by one, directly like talking about the spaces that we use, or like where you might find yourself, and then more broadly discussing like how do you interact with bureaucracy, or how far do you allow yourself, depending on what you want to do or achieve. So in the particular, like there are always going to be people who aren't going to be down with whatever you're doing. So, but if you're doing it with conviction and you're being consistent, then you will find people who will ride with you who like might not otherwise, you know, where it's like, oh, I don't know about this whole leftist thing, but you sure do show up with 800 families worth of groceries. So shit. Okay. And like you'll find people who will say, you know, well, if you're this or that, then you won't get this or you won't get that. And it's like, look, if someone's going to support you in a traumatic situation because you're doing something, then good. And if they don't, then they never cared. And it's okay. And there are plenty of other people out there who do care, who are like, oh, you know, maybe your politics are different than mine, but like I have this stuff I'm sitting on and I'm not doing anything with it. And you're going to do something with it. So here, take it. Those are the people who are going to be out there. And, you know, like for the church, we're in a very good situation. I mean, Unitarian Universalists are, you know, generally inclusive, especially comparatively. It's not specifically white Jesus-y, you know, and it's very much a space where it's like, you know, they have a Black Lives Matter flag out front. They have gender diverse bathroom plaques downstairs to make sure people understand that like, it really doesn't matter where anyone pees here. So we're very fortunate in that specific instance, but generally it's just like, I mean, just keep doing what you're going to do, because that's really what's going to carry you through those situations, and find you next to the people who are going to be like, shit, okay, well, but I, you know, this is your politics, but I see you doing this. You know, when I'm down in Dulac and Pointe-a-Chan with people wearing Trump hats doing hurricane relief, like they, we're not talking about politics, but they can't help but see me sitting here with a Black Lives Matter wristband and whatever leftist shirt I have on, just being like, I don't care, take the food. Sorry. But so broadly to the bureaucracy of it all and how do you interact with that? GNO Caring Collective isn't a political organization, but existence is political, and I am a face of it, if not the face of it. So my accountability is like, if anyone ever talks to me, I'm like, I am an anti-capitalist, I am an anti-fascist, I am an organizer for harm reduction and supporting marginalized leadership in this mess. But that doesn't preclude me from doing whatever I need to do to support the community around me who doesn't necessarily know any of that language. And, this is gonna possibly surprise some people to hear it, but like, we don't have a choice but to interact with capitalism. Like, we exist in it. You can't like, oh, I'm not in it. No, you are, you have no choice. So therefore, as we deal with institutions and bureaucracies, they're gonna be there. If you wanna deal with big food, if you wanna get a lot of food, it's gonna be tough not to deal with big food banks, and they're a mess. But, will your politics allow you to go deal with that and make practical, pragmatic decisions based upon, still being consistent with your values while also recognizing coalition building and the power of ground up hyper-local community? I mean, churches are the #1 places we should be going and letting people know our climate justice ideology, our radical self-liberation ideology, because they're, the people who are connected the most to those neighborhoods. So yeah, you can't escape the bureaucracy. You can avoid it and mitigate it. And part of that ability is, creating a smaller framework for what you want to do, because you don't want to deal with that. But if you're trying to make structural, confrontational moves, then, again, you're going to be interacting with this all the time. So it's just, how do you get used to dealing with it and navigating it in a way consistent with shared values of your collective or your own internal, self.
Yeah, and on that, I wanted to ask, do you consider, not that this label is necessarily important, but do you consider your group a mutual aid initiative, and how does that contrast to like a charity initiative? Or do you consider it something on its total own outside of either of those?
I mean, I'll go first, I guess. So it's very much mutual aid. It is, mutual aid, again, is a term. This is solidarity, not charity, is the simplest way to put it. And that's intentional, and it's anti-capitalist. And mutual aid itself is an anti-capitalist concept. And it's always important to remember that, because it gets kind of thrown around a lot. Like, it's a response to structural hierarchy and economic exploitation that rejects that entirely and says, what if we just get the things or share them? Or like, if I have this skill, what if I just did it for my community because I cared, and that was actually like intrinsically valuable in a meaningful way, and it brought me all the things I needed, and I didn't even know that it would. That's what mutual aid is. And it's part of, in the same way that a lot of terms get thrown around, like harm reduction, same thing. The mutual aid is often harm reduction, but it's part of a greater strategy or consciousness of the reality that we have to support each other in different ways than we have. Like, these systems are created very carefully and laid out very intricately, and for us to go against that, like, we really have to just reframe our own relationship. And that's what mutual aid can help us do as a term, as long as we don't forget that it's explicitly against the systems of economic exploitation that, again, we have no choice but to interact with.
I have always said mutual aid is the biggest fuck you to the government, because it shows that communities can take care of communities. What I found recently is that everybody loves a fucking label, and they will try to label things, and then they will tell you you're not doing that because it doesn't fit your label. Do the work. What I will say is that even within our own organization, I think that sometimes our food distros aren't necessarily mutual aid unless we're getting them from like, donations or whatever have you. Our community refrigerators and pantries, that is mutual aid. And I try to focus our org on doing more things that will outlast the organization itself. No matter what, if the Newark Water Coalition goes away tomorrow, there are 3 community refrigerators and 1 dry good pantry that can live forever. And what's been even more amazing is that like we rarely fill them up anymore because community is filling them up. And to me, that is quintessentially mutual aid. And then I remember doing a food distribution one time, and this woman comes up and she has like frozen collard greens or something like that. And on the table we had like apples or some fruit, and she's like, I'm gonna leave this collard green so somebody else can take it, and I'm gonna take this fruit because this is what I really need. And I was like, bam, there it is right there in its rawest form. And the other point I wanted to make when it comes to mutual aid is that culturally, borrowing that cup of sugar from your neighbor, that's mutual aid. It's us just really taking care of each other. A lot of people have a lot of different ways that that looks like in or tangibly in real life, but ultimately it really is just showing up for one another, and doing it in a way that you're, like you said, just not relying on the system or showing that we can do this ourselves, and it and can scale up. The fact is we just brought a greenhouse that, that is where we want to be at with our food distros. And not, I know that's not capable for, or not everybody has the privilege to do that, but again, think bigger. There's only so much that we can do on a block by block basis. And now is not the time to fuck around. Like, if you really believe in this work, if you really believe in revolutionary politics or being a revolutionary, it means doing the most that you can. This is not a game. This is not a lifestyle. This is it, right? This is what you decide to do. And and then I can't help but touch on the mental health aspect. Like, doing this work involves community, and self-care is community care, and mutual aid is also taking care of our fellow organizers, activists, and just community members. So just think of the different ways that mutual aid looks like, and don't limit yourself to certain terms or ideologies.
Yeah, I would definitely say that Marxist Mushrooms is not inherently a mutual aid initiative, but more so an avenue as a community connector is kind of the term that I like to use, which is basically like, I'm here to distribute information to you so that you can then go into your own community or your own spaces and continue to build that information. What I think is really interesting and what makes it more than the average in regards to fungi is that you can grow food out of nothing. You don't need to purchase anything in order to literally create a sustainable self-growing like mushroom patch basically. And I thought that's important for people to know. It didn't require the same information and just like preconceived privilege around like gardening or farm school or like any of that shit. Like, I taught myself how to do this as someone who like did not come from a farming background or didn't come from like a green thumb background. Like, I maybe knew how to keep a cactus alive, maybe, but I knew that there needed to be a way for folks to be able to not have to rely on big ag, but specifically like big meat to get nutrients or get something filling in their stomachs. I'm also like a chunky person. I'm a person who has a very complicated and very nuanced relationship with food. And a large part of that is because of the socioeconomic positionality that I held growing up and the position that I had as a person in a food desert. And so I found that like the role that I could occupy was connecting all these, coffee shops that keep popping up in all these gentrified areas and taking all of their coffee bean waste because they have a lot of like excess grounds for free, getting it out of their hair and connecting it with a lot of excess tissue or cardboard from local construction or from Walmart or Ulta's or different grocery stores or what, and just making mushroom patches or connecting individuals who are part of different mutual aid initiatives, specifically like Matt RVA being able to connect their individual, their like point person and the person that I was teaching around fungi to different distributors to pick up their own resources so that I don't have to be there to take out the middleman. And I think that's really important for people to do that work because you have different organizations who are stepping up to the plate, who are willing to go there, but they can't carry everything. And not everybody can be forced into these particular like traditional roles on how to engage with community. And I saw an avenue that fit me and my mental health as someone who's also working a full-time job, who's autistic, who's like a caregiver to a mentally ill family member, a way that I could contribute and meet a need and have an access point that needed to be met and connect individuals and different organizations and show people that you can just get up and do what you need to do if you need to do it. Um, so yeah, I don't necessarily consider Marxist Mushrooms a mutual aid and organization or initiative right now. I would love to get to that one day, a place where you can just like go and pick your own free mushrooms and there's like mushroom patches and guerrilla mushrooming in every neighborhood. That'd be dope. I would love the time to do that. But I would consider it to be like community connecting and education and time and just like general labor that I'm putting out to literally fill in some of the missing spots where our state structures aren't reaching the people that need to be met. Um, so yeah, that's my cat.
I know my dream is to have mushroom patches everywhere mushrooms. That would be amazing. Okay, we have Violet's message in the chat. Any advice on how to handle internal issues in mutual aid organizing, such as abusers in the space or political disagreements, etc.?
The way that I will say interpersonal issues are probably the hardest thing to deal with, like in organizing, just period. What we've done, and we've done several different things at several different times when we have several different issues. Um, and I think the biggest thing is bringing in an outside facilitator has helped us a lot. Like just because of our network and our community, we know people that do like accountability, transformative justice, and things like that. Because it's very hard to do it internally with everyone who has been harmed intentionally, maybe not intentionally, maybe subconsciously, and not realize it. So by bringing in an outside party, if you can, and there are a lot of free resources on this. And there's a lot of organizations that do this kind of work. That tends to be the best route because then you can leave or you could put everything on the table, and facilitators are obviously trained or trauma informed trained to handle these situations. So I know there's different ways, but that's been the way that generally works for me or for our organization.
I'm trying to figure out how detailed a response or how hyperbolic one is, which one's more appropriate. Because like my first thought is, I mean, with political disagreements, directly mutually organizing, it's hopefully is minimal because it's really about direct action. And if you want to talk theory, there are places to talk theory. Like this is praxis. But of course, people have different visions on like what's an appropriate action or what tactics, to use or stuff like that. It's hard to say without knowing what size of a group or organization it is. but vulnerability is important for all of us, especially men, especially white men. Like, coming into a space and situation just prepared to be vulnerable and learn from the people around us, rather than like feeling like we need to be rigid on our position or who we are already. I mean, that's, it's probably Vice, better than I do, but it's just, that's a big reality with this, I think, is like a lot of people need to humble themselves towards the process itself, rather than feeling like, a single situation is going to define us, or determine, like, if someone else has a different opinion about how something goes, like, are we going to go with it, or like, is it something that will carry us forward, or is it something that we're going to be standing around still talking about? Because ultimately the talking it has very little impact over the material conditions around us. It's all about how do we take specific steps. And my specific advice to how you handle those internal issues is create those specific accountabilities and language, at the beginning with your affinity group or organization or whatever. Create some bylaws and absolutely consider what might go wrong. Some of the best advice someone has given me in 2 years of this is, consider what would happen if you had to dissolve this. Like, that's how you have to think about, even when you're beginning on ideas, like, what if you had to end this idea? Like, how would you organize bylaws? How would you organize your structure in such a way that that's possible, that people have voice to do that? It's pretty heavy, but it taught me a lot about, the practicality of disagreements, and, and then allowing abusers to take over a space without there being a way to hold them accountable.
I don't really think I have a whole much more to add, beside what Dan and Anthony said. I think they really said it all. I think the advice that I can give is umbrella advice, meaning, conflict resolution is literally the biggest issue in humanity. Like, our inability to communicate and resolve conflict is what has led to capitalism in this moment, among many other things, among any issue. Like, our inability to be able to communicate the separation of resources or food or land or whatever. And because of that, it's an age-old problem that's not going to have any one particular perfect answer. And that it is going to be very specific to the environment and to the individuals and the organization at hand, or the situation at hand. But I think, like they said, having a point of accountability is really important. Having a set list of, where I come from, we call them like acuerdos, or like community bylaws, community agreements. Um, Basically, like, what's your, like, no nonsense, what's your no tolerance, what's the hard line. And I'll say, like, from an autistic perspective, I really appreciate when the moral rules are written out, are just like clear as can be. Like, things need to be transparent. We don't tolerate transphobia, we don't tolerate xenophobia, like, just like explicit. And I think it helps everyone, the more explicit that we are around conflict resolution and around miscommunication, because conflict also can arrive out of miscommunication or improper, incomplete forms of communication. And so, yeah, best thing you can do is have points of accountability, and also work to have a sense of trust in your organization or in your initiative, um, and know that everyone can harm and everyone can be harmed.
Yeah, so I think we'll start closing out, and just on a open space if you want to touch on anything else that we've talked about today. But the closing question being, what is your dream for your community space, or the community spaces where you live?
So one of the things that I realized, especially in the city of Newark, is that it's very, very hard to find space that you feel, one, safe in, and two, are able to build on your ideas. Like a space that has the resources to do whatever you want. So we have like a vinyl cutter, a sublimation printer, a button maker, a 3D printer, all kinds of shit. And, this is what I do. And for some take it, or folks like, can I have a cup of water? And so real, I hate to use, but like a melting pot. Oh no.
Yeah, Anthony, maybe you could turn off your video.
I don't, yeah, I don't, is it this better?
Yeah, yeah.
Hmm. So it's just like a melting pot, like this place where like every idea is possible and feels possible. Like I really, really want that for my community.
Dream. I think in the bigger picture, the goal would be, or the dream would be, to be able to grow and distribute medicinal, edible, and psychedelic fungi to the community properly, um, and all of those avenues. I think one of the things that we're wanting to explore slash like do more work in trying to figure out an avenue for is psychedelic therapy and or using traditional medicines to help mental aid or mental health transitions through late stage capitalism, and acknowledging that so many of our state medical systems have already been failing people for decades, but are going to be super inaccessible. It shouldn't have to take another COVID for us to see that. And basically finding ways that folks can get access to medicinal fungi, mental health based psychedelic fungi, and gourmet slash edible fungi, that's what they call it, and also have the information and can do so for free, period. But can also share that information and have a way to absorb what I think should be common knowledge. I'm a part of the like tradition that believes that there should be so many more people with this kind of information on how to do stuff, and whether it's how to care for your like fatally ill grandmother, whether it's how to harvest a particular type of fungi and use it for respiratory tea, like just natural medicines. That kind of information shouldn't be gatekept behind a $400 webinar series or a certification. If there are autodactyls or people who can teach themselves this information, and you acknowledge that this information can be useful to an entire community, share it, and do so if you can without having to charge for it. That idea that you have to charge for something is literally just capitalism being like, come on, participate in valuing your labor at a certain amount. And if you have the privilege, like I do in this sense, to have a full-time job and to not have to, then just go for it. And so I think the like big picture dream would be to be able to figure out a way to partner with a larger nonprofit, and we have one kind of in mind, or a larger like mutual aid distro organization, and find a way to build avenues on educating people not only how to grow, but also how to forage, also how to use, and also how to share that information across the board, whether it's food, natural medicines, or mental health.
So one thing about Bulbancha is that it's incredibly neighborhood out anyways. Like just the places are very hyper local here. And it's not like a turf thing. It's just everyone's proud of where they grew up and, you know, the neighborhoods they're from. And they feel a great connection to the physical space around them in a positive way. You know, Katrina certainly impacted that as well for the people who remained and the people who came back. So my answer is couched in that because it's such an amazingly connected place. Like my dream for community spaces here are, you know, ones of all different sizes, you know, whether it's like 2 people in their garage or 5 people renting a house or, you know, 15 people renting a community space or starting a nonprofit or starting a you know, non-profit, just people doing stuff. You know, all those different groups being able to know what each other are doing and support each other and share resources, share information. When Geno Caring Collective was at its height of community service for the Geno area directly, and we had 1,050 families in every single zip code and like 4 different parishes. It was about taking the hyperlocal leadership of people who would be checking on those folks and know them far better than we could or any one person could. And taking that hyperlocal leadership and supporting and building around it and saying like, okay, well, let us go get the other resources for you or let us share your resources from this neighborhood into this other one that needs this specifically. That kind of co-organization and, you know, understanding that like we have to build networks to support each other because they won't support us. Like the system will not support us. The system will specifically not support us. They won't fail to either. They will succeed at not supporting us. So like we have to be there for each other. And, you know, we have to do it on a lot of different levels. It can't just be like one thing I learned coming up off the ground on this was like, you know, you help 5 families and it feels great. Like you help 50 families, it doesn't feel great anymore. It just feels like, how the hell were we able to get here and make this much of an impact? Because like I thought this was what society was for. So, you know, my dream is that we really stop believing that everything is just okay, while also realizing we can't do everything. And sometimes, you know, just cooking 15 meals and putting it in your community fridge every week is a radical act of love and empathy. And that is, you know, to go off the title of this, that is a weapon. It's a weapon that people who don't act with empathy really can't plan for or perceive. Like, what you mean you would all just do this just with your free time and you have a whole job and like social life and mental health and you have family members and, you know, you still just choose to do this? Like it's confusing to them, and it makes it so that we can move in ways that they can't perceive. And that's why it's so, you know, important for the community centers in your community and in your neighborhood and everything to like find each other and connect and support each other, especially if you're white. Get the fuck out of the way and just support the leadership that's already been there for generations. It's already going to be doing shit you haven't even thought of. Other white people. That's all I'm talking to there.
Well, thank you all so much for sharing your wisdom, and wonderful way to close us out, Dan, with bringing it back to the title of Weaponizing Empathy. Thanks so much for attending, and hope that this can inspire some folks to get involved a little more. So thank you all so much.